Think Ford built some of the worst V8 engines of the 1970s? Then stick around, because by the end of this video, you might completely change your mind about two engines that have spent decades being unfairly ridiculed. The Ford 351M and 400 have been called everything from smog-choked disappointments to oversized boat anchors, and if you spend enough time online, you'll find no shortage of people ready to tell you they're among the worst V8s Ford ever produced. But here's the surprising part. Most of that criticism isn't aimed at the actual engineering of these engines. It's aimed at what happened to them after government regulations, emissions requirements, and corporate compromises got involved. Once you dig into their history, you discover a very different story one, where these engines were actually built on a remarkably solid foundation and never truly got the opportunity to show what they were capable of. To understand why the 351M and 400 ended up with such a bad reputation, you first have to understand where they came from. The story begins in 1971 when Ford introduced the 400 cubic inch V8. This wasn't some hastily assembled stopgap engine. It was a carefully developed member of Ford's 335 series engine family, sharing its roots with the famous 351 Cleveland. By that point, the Cleveland had already earned respect thanks to its advanced cylinder head design, canted valves, and efficient airflow characteristics. Ford engineers saw potential in that architecture and wanted to expand it into something larger and more capable. At the time, Ford faced a growing challenge. The Fay series engines, including stalwarts like the 390, had served faithfully for years, but they were becoming increasingly difficult to adapt to upcoming emissions regulations. Meanwhile, the 429 and 460 big blocks offered tremendous power, but came with significant weight and size penalties. Ford needed an engine that could sit comfortably between those two extremes. It needed strong torque, decent efficiency, and enough durability to handle larger vehicles without the bulk of a traditional big block. The solution was the 400. Engineers started with the Cleveland design and made several important changes. The deck height was increased substantially, growing from 9.206 inches to 10.297 inches. That extra space allowed the stroke to increase dramatically, stretching from the Cleveland's 3.5 inches to a full 4 inches. Main bearing journals grew as well, reaching 3 inches in diameter. The connecting rods became longer, measuring 6.58 inches compared to the Cleveland's 5.78-inch rods. Those longer rods contributed to smoother operation and favorable internal geometry, characteristics that would become one of the engine's hidden strengths. The resulting 400 cubic inch V8 delivered exactly what Ford wanted. It produced excellent low-end torque, ran smoothly, and fit perfectly into applications where pulling power mattered more than high RPM horsepower. Another interesting detail that many enthusiasts overlook is the bell housing pattern. Rather than using the standard small block pattern, the 400 shared its bell housing bolt pattern with the 429 and 460 big blocks. That wasn't an accident. Ford envisioned the engine for demanding applications from the beginning. When the 400 debuted in 1971, it was actually a respectable performer. Flat-top pistons gave it a healthy 9.01 compression ratio, allowing the engine to produce solid power and responsive performance. Ford marketed it as the larger sibling of the 351 Cleveland, and for good reason. In its original form, the engine did exactly what it was designed to do. Drivers received strong torque, smooth operation, and plenty of capability for larger vehicles. Unfortunately, timing was not on the engine's side. As the early 1970s progressed, emissions regulations became increasingly strict. Automakers across the industry scrambled to comply, and the technology available at the time was nowhere near as sophisticated as what exists today. There were no advanced engine computers, no modern fuel injection systems, no variable valve timing, and no complex emissions management strategies. Manufacturers were forced to achieve compliance using much cruder methods. For the 400, those changes began quickly. In 1972, compression dropped from 9.01 to 8.41 through the use of dished pistons. Only a year later, compression fell again to approximately 8.01. Then came one of the most damaging changes of all. Camshaft timing was retarded by 6 degrees. While that adjustment helped reduce emissions, it also hurt dynamic compression, weakened throttle response, and robbed the engine of much of its lively character. The situation worsened further in 1975. New emissions requirements forced additional revisions to the cylinder heads. Exhaust ports became more restrictive due to redesigned cooling passages and the integration of thermactor air injection systems. Combined with catalytic converters and other emissions equipment, these changes significantly reduced the engine's breathing ability. By this point, the 400's performance had been severely compromised compared to its original 1971 configuration. Around the same time, another important development took place. Production of the 351 Cleveland was ending, yet Ford still needed a 351 cubic inch engine to satisfy demand. Rather than designing an entirely new power plant, Ford chose a practical solution. Engineers took the 400's tall deck block and installed a shorter stroke crankshaft with a 3.5-inch stroke, matching the Cleveland's dimensions. Since the engine retained the same connecting rods as the 400, taller pistons were required to compensate for the reduced stroke. The result was the 351 Modified, better known as the 351M. On paper, the concept made sense. The 351M inherited the same robust architecture as the 400, while offering a displacement that fit Ford's existing lineup. In reality, however, it arrived during the worst possible era. Like the 400, it was saddled with low compression ratios, emissions-oriented cam timing, restrictive cylinder heads, and all the smog equipment of the mid-1970s. It was offered exclusively with a 2-barrel carburetor and small port 2V Cleveland-style heads. Performance enthusiasts immediately judged it based on those disappointing factory specifications. But here's the critical detail that often gets ignored. None of those problems were fundamental flaws in the engine's design. The block wasn't weak, the bottom end wasn't poorly engineered, the architecture wasn't inherently flawed. The performance issues were largely the result of emissions-related compromises imposed on virtually every American V8 during the decade. That context becomes even more important when looking at how Ford used these engines. Beginning in 1977, both the 351M and 400 became key players in Ford's truck lineup. The 351M served as the standard engine in numerous F-Series trucks and full-size Broncos, while the 400 remained available as an optional upgrade. For truck duty, horsepower numbers weren't everything. Torque was king. This is where the 400 in particular shined. Thanks to its long 4-inch stroke, it produced strong low-end torque exactly where truck owners needed it. Peak torque arrived at relatively low RPM, making it well suited for towing, hauling, and off-road driving. While performance enthusiasts focused on quarter-mile times and horsepower ratings, truck owners appreciated engines that could pull heavy loads without constant downshifting. Many people who actually use these engines in work environments developed a much more favorable opinion of them than the automotive press or performance crowd ever did. The engines weren't exciting, but they were dependable torque producers, capable of moving substantial weight without complaint. The problem was perception. By the late 1970s, enthusiasts were still comparing new engines to the glory days of muscle cars. Compared to engines like the Boss 351 or the 429 Cobra Jet, the 351M and 400 looked disappointing. Horsepower ratings had plummeted across the industry. Compression ratios were lower. Performance was down everywhere. Unfortunately, those comparisons ignored the reality of the era. The high-compression muscle car engines that enthusiasts loved had effectively disappeared. The automotive landscape had changed dramatically, and the 351M and 400 were products of that new reality. Several factors contributed to their negative reputation. The timing of their introduction certainly didn't help. They arrived during one of the most unpopular periods in American automotive history. The confusing naming structure also caused problems. Ford simultaneously offered the 351 Cleveland, 351 Windsor, and 351M. Three completely different engines shared nearly identical names, creating confusion among buyers and enthusiasts alike. Then, there were the legitimate shortcomings. Factory tuning was uninspiring, compression ratios were low, cam timing hurt responsiveness, exhaust restrictions limited breathing, oiling system weaknesses occasionally surfaced under demanding conditions. Owners who pushed these engines hard sometimes encountered rod bearing issues, especially at higher RPM levels. Yet even these problems weren't necessarily fatal flaws. As enthusiasts later discovered, nearly every weakness could be addressed. Unfortunately, before many people had a chance to explore the engine's potential, Ford moved on. By 1980, the engines were already being phased out, and by 1982, they were effectively gone. The entire 335 series engine family disappeared, taking with it one of Ford's most interesting engine architectures. The engines faded away, but the reputation remained. For decades, online discussions continued repeating the same criticisms. People dismissed the 351M and 400 as junk without ever examining what lay beneath the factory tuning. Many enthusiasts simply accepted the narrative without first-hand experience. Then, something interesting happened. A small community of builders began revisiting these engines and experimenting with them. What they discovered surprised a lot of people. The foundation was actually excellent. The blocks were strong and durable. The tall deck design provided flexibility for displacement increases. The long connecting rods offered favorable geometry. Main journals were substantial. Even the often overlooked 2V Cleveland-style heads flowed impressively compared to many contemporary designs. The key difference now is access to information. Builders no longer have to rely on trial and error. Years of shared experience have created a roadmap for anyone interested in unlocking the potential of these engines. Looking back, the story of the 351M and 400 is really a story about timing. These engines arrived during one of the most difficult periods in automotive history. They were forced to operate under restrictions that dramatically limited their potential. Then they were judged primarily on those compromised versions, rather than on the strengths of their underlying design. The Ford 351M and 400 are perfect examples of that phenomenon. After decades of criticism, they're finally receiving the second look they always deserved. And for those willing to dig deeper, the truth is surprisingly simple. These engines were never the villains automotive history made them out to be.